What is up, everybody, and welcome to Robeytech. Today we are talking about a very important subject, and that is
rectal bleeding is something you should discuss with your doctor.
And that is, hey Robey, I'm gonna buy a new GPU, like I can buy one, but if I did, how is CyberPunk 2077 going to run? Well, I know there's been a ton of videos on this, and essentially what we wanted to do is we said, yeah, I don't want to just sit there and show you a bunch of charts and walk you all through this, and then all in all, like, you have to make decisions in and of itself. We're going to talk about each and every card, walk through them one by one, talk about the ideal settings for you to get it at 60 FPS, and that you feel comfortable in terms of when you purchase it, how the game is going to run. Now, because of that, and the length of this video, what we've done below, down in the description, is a link to every single different GPU. So you can just skip ahead. You're like, hey, I want to get a 3070, go check out a 3070. Hey, I want to know about Rage Mode, I should go check out Rage Mode. I got a 6900XT, go click on that instead. Or you can hang out, enjoy my super sultry voice, know that it's literally just making you a better person by hearing the vibes I'm sending through the camera, and you're just moments of joy are being... Okay, maybe not. What I want to make sure that is important is the reason it took us so long is because we spent a lot of time going through this data. So we want to make sure we were super accurate. And because of that, we actually have one card that actually went between patch 1.04 and patch 1.05. So we apologize, we asterisked all that stuff out. We'll talk about that more as we get through the data. But for now, let's jump into the cards. Why, Robey, did it take you so long to show the data? We wanted to take a lot of time. This was our first one of these videos. We wanted to make sure that we got it right. So there was a lot of time that Kevin spent going from card to card to card. As he saw data, he did analysis, made sure it was correct. We asked a lot of questions. We tried to figure things out to make sure that we're presenting this. And we'd love to know down in the comments below if this kind of information is helpful, because I did not know this, but it is amazing how much time these things take. What it takes to coordinate, what it takes to run this kind of information. Not that I didn't have a lot of respect, I had a lot of respect for people like Hardware Unboxed and Jay, specifically Hardware Unboxed, and especially Steve over at Gamers Nexus for the amount of effort that these kind of videos take. Let's talk about what we did. I want to walk you guys through the testing methodology in this case, because I think it's super important that you guys understand what it was that we tried to do. Because unlike many other games, CyberPunk 2077 did not have like a benchmark mode, which a lot of us, when we do these kind of benchmarks, do. So I wanted to walk you guys through hey, here's the systems that we're actually using when we're actually doing the testing. We tested on Intel and we tested on AMD. I also wanted to tell you why we only chose 1440p and 4K versus testing at 1080p, because that is a very different test. And then finally, let's talk about what the actual testing was when we ran through this, what was probably like 50 different times to make sure that we had all the right data. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about the two systems. So we tested Intel and we tested AMD. The Intel build was an Intel 10700K, not important in terms of it was just stock, everything was stock. We ran G.Skill 32 gig memory kit of G.Skill. We ran a Western Digital Blue NVMe, 500 gig for our OS drive. We had a second Western Digital Blue M.2 1 terabyte drive that we ran as a game drive. Same on the AMD build in terms of their NVMe specs. For the AMD build, we ran a 5600X at 6 core. We also ran Triton Z at 32 gig memory kit, and then similar stuff in terms of the setup from there. Now, key part, guys, that I want to make sure that you understand. One, we only tested 1440p and we only tested 4K. When you start doing 1080p, because of how much the CPU has an impact at 1080p, given how much work it does, at that point in time, it's actually less of a GPU test and more of a CPU test. Really what I want to do is, like, if you are going to game at 1440p or 4K, which is really when your GPU becomes super dependent, this is where this information becomes super relevant. So if you wanted to find like a 1080p, like what's your best at 1080p, all in all, then you're probably looking at trying to get a higher end AMD CPU or a higher end Intel CPU. A couple other things that I want to talk about when we talk about our testing methodology. One, what we are looking for is a solid above 60 FPS. Understand, CyberPunk 2077 is a very big game, and there are other places within that game that are really going to push resolution. So we were trying to find something that was very comfortable when we did our testing that was north of 60 FPS, because we think of 60 as kind of the minimum bar you will be able to have data to see what you can do if you were looking for 30, but 60 was kind of our minimum bar in terms of a great gaming experience. Second thing, let's talk about what we did from the level. We did the level, which was at the very beginning, past the prelude. We were basically where you first start out. It's the first full mission of the game. A couple reasons that we basically chose that. One, it has a ton, like it's been used in many demos. It has a ton of bells and whistles thrown in, everything from lighting, heavy draw distances, fog, all that stuff was built into it. The way that the gameplay was played was the best of our ability. Because we don't have a benchmark, we had to do this as close as we could to the same, but there is some human variation. We started the mission mostly stealth, then we engaged the boss into a firefight. We played through the same sequence as we did through as best we could, but given we don't have benchmarks, there is going to be some human error in this, but for the most part, we feel very confident in terms of the quality of our numbers, given how close we were able to come in terms of playing this. So we were very, very thorough in terms of trying to give us the best core data set in the best manner possible, as scientifically as we can, without being able to have like just a straight up benchmark that we could run against CyberPunk 2077. So there it is. That's the full picture that tells you what we tested, why we tested it, what we're looking for, and what we used to basically find the numbers that we did. So the first card that we use is the EVGA GeForce RTX 3060 Ti. Unfortunately, we do not have Founders Editions for every single one of these. So again, there may be some slight variation given that we didn't use Founder Edition, but all in all, like we're talking about the variation between different cards being relatively low. But this is the card that we used for this particular one. We tested at 1440p medium, 1440p high, 1440p ultra, and then we also tested just slightly to see what it meant if we did 4K at low. Now, what we're looking for is we're looking for that high number, where it basically, what is it running at high, and then where ideally you're basically going to enjoy playing this game. Recommendation for the 3060 Ti is 1440p high, where it's getting in at 66 FPS. You're gonna be able to see here from these charts that we're showing here that even at 2160, we were getting close to 57 at low at 4K. Ultra was getting close to 60, but again, we were looking for that right above, well north of 60 FPS, so you knew you had a very comfortable amount of room when you were playing the game. The 1% lows, we'll talk a little about those. Again, remember when our 1% low is just when it hit this. This was not consistently, but you can see the lows were very low. When we compare Intel versus AMD, which we're showing the AMD numbers up here right now, you can see within the margin of error, they can pretty much be looked at as pretty much the same. Now, we're talking about ray tracing because this is an NVIDIA card. In this case, we're recommending 1440p ray tracing at medium. Recommendation, 3060 Ti in brief, 1440p at high with ray tracing set to medium for a 60 FPS or higher experience. Okay, so let's talk about the RTX 3070. And this is where, for the first time, if you really wanted to, you could actually look at doing 4K. So one of the things I want to make super clear about the way CyberPunk works is you actually have multiple settings. You have ultra, high, medium, and then low, but then you have ultra ray tracing and ray tracing medium. Now there is a custom setting where you can set all this stuff individually, but in this case, when I sit there and say, hey, ray trace medium, that doesn't mean medium and then you can add ray trace medium. It means medium or you're just selecting ray trace medium or you're selecting ray trace ultra. Okay, so let's talk about the 3070 specifically. Now, I want to be super clear. AMD and Intel, in this case, again, within margin of error, actually they're pretty close to the same experience. This is just kind of showing you though, where actual CPU, because the 5600X is technically more powerful from a gaming standpoint than the 10700K. But again, this is showing you why the CPU matters a whole lot less when we talk about gaming at 1440p and 4K. So for the RTX 3070, our recommendation in this case is 1440p Ultra, or you could do 1440p 1440p ray trace to medium. Now, 1440p ray trace at Ultra is actually at 59.6 frames. So if you're okay with that little bit of dip below 60, you could play at that. But again, our recommendation, given how important this game is and north of 60 FPS can feel, we're saying 1440p medium ray tracing, or you can do 1440p Ultra without ray tracing, and you'll get that north of 60 FPS. if you do want to do 4K, you can do 4K at low at a solid greater than 60 FPS. This is no ray tracing whatsoever. And as you go from medium to high to ultra, you can do 4K at around 30 FPS if you're okay with that resolution change. But our recommendation, if you're looking for a greater than 60 FPS experience, is 1440p ray trace medium. Okay, so let's talk about the RTX 3080 and our first real entry in CyberPunk 2077 at 4K. You are capable, if you really want to, 4K medium, very easy to be able to do both 4K medium or 2160p at medium for either ray tracing on or ray tracing off, coming in both on Intel and on AMD at north of 60 with room to grow. If you are looking for, and you are capable of, and you're okay with a greater than 30 FPS but sub 60 FPS experience, you can play 2160p Ultra, which is 4K Ultra, and ray tracing at Ultra, but you're looking at a very similar experience as playing something on the Xbox Series X. Obviously, 4K Ultra and 4K Ray Trace Ultra on a PC is significantly higher than a Series X, but again, it is 4K. You're getting it close to 30 FPS, which is what you're seeing on the console, but obviously with much higher amounts of ray tracing and all of the bells and whistles and everything else. So our recommendation, if you're looking for a 60 FPS experience either on Intel or on AMD, is to run it at 4K medium and 4K medium ray trace, and then making your choice. If you want to do 1440p, you can do all the bells and whistles, all that stuff. But again, 4K medium is the best in terms of where you're going to do it, just getting at 60 FPS in terms of pushing the game in the absolute best way. Let's talk about the 3090, the granddaddy, the big beast when it comes to the top of the NVIDIA stack. And alas, everything NVIDIA said, guess what? 10 to 15% boost in frames when we talk about looking at the difference between a 3080 and a 3090. When you talk about CyberPunk as their like crowning achievement for for showing their GPU, guess what? 10 to 15% is what you got. Now, when you talk about that 60 frame per second, when you're looking at 2160p or 4K at high, you're getting at 56.9 frames per second, which is super close. Even the lows at greater than 30 frames per second, which remember your minimum frame rate 1% low, not as big of a deal. It doesn't hit that all that often. But again, you could technically, you're super close to 60 frames per second on 4K high. Now, 4K medium is what we're recommending because now instead of being closer to 60, it's well into the 70s, which means you can play this entire game natively at 4K on medium, both 4K medium native and 4K medium ray trace. And again, this exists both on Intel and AMD. In both of these cases, they're almost identical because we know that CPU isn't going to be a big of an issue when we're talking about 4K gaming in this case. Now, remember the 3080 is $700-800, and then the 3090 is, $1,200, $1,300, $1,400. When you're talking about what's essentially like, is it worth that 4K native, close to 4K high native at close to 60 FPS for literally double the cost? When you think about things like DLSS and stuff like that, I wouldn't really kind of say spending the money on something like this when you can do 4K ultra ray traced DLSS at close to 60 FPS on a 3080. That seems like a better deal. But that is it for this one. Recommendation in this case is 4K medium easily, 4K retrace medium native easily, or if you wanted to try and up it to 4K high, you could. If you're looking at that greater than 30 FPS, you could do 4K Ultra with this card and get that Xbox Series X experience at greater than 30, at much better looking all up. So that's it for the RTX 3090. So hold on to your butts. We're gonna talk about AMD. Here it is, Team Red, all of them in here. Now this is an exciting time, and it's exciting because there was a time not that long ago, and even like I would say come October, that we thought we will actually have like AMD cards and having it stack up against pretty much the hottest game of the year. And that's not to say that this is these guys don't do a great job when it comes to heavy hitting against their NVIDIA counterparts in CyberPunk 2077. Understand though that CyberPunk is definitely in bed with NVIDIA, and because of that is heavily optimized for NVIDIA. And there's new tech that was released along with these cards, specifically Smart Access Memory and Rage Mode, that if a developer doesn't take advantage of, it doesn't necessarily make a big difference. Now, that's not to say it didn't make any difference, but it did not make a large difference when it comes to these particular cards. Now, let's talk about smart access memory. For those of you who don't know what smart access memory is, you can think of it like this. When you used to when you had a CPU or whatever it was, basically, and you made any graphics call, that graphics call had to be mapped in a specific way. What smart access memory actually does now is it gives developers the opportunity to have the entire map and all channel bandwidth for video RAM. The problem is that because developers were making calls a legacy way before then, and if they didn't make changes to account for this, with smart access memory, which is required to be on in order to activate rage mode, developers do need to do some work and optimization to really make rage mode effective. And that's why when you see games like Gears of War or Dirt that actually has this stuff where you see those massive boosts, because there is some optimization on that side. So when you look at these charts here, we're showing a smart access memory, that's why you're seeing things just kind of be very random, because smart access memory in and of itself is going to take some work from the developer side to optimize correctly. Which also leads us into rage mode, because rage mode is very similar. Again, we are seeing, and you're seeing here looking at the chart, you are seeing slight boosts. Now, we did not test rage mode across all of this. What we want to do is we basically said, hey, let's take the 6900XT, the biggest, beefiest boy, and make sure, hey, if we're going to turn this on, what is the difference? Because more than likely, we're going to see very similar uplift across the entire spectrum of 6000 series cards. And what you're seeing here is like, yes, at 2160 high, within margin of error, because there's not a lot of optimizations, and again, a lot of stuff's being pushed at this, you're not seeing a massive amount of difference. In fact, it's margin of error. We could say, technically, we could do 5, 6, 7 runs and not actually even see a big difference. But at medium, which is, we're talking about the same weight class that you're looking at for the 3080, but again, a much more expensive card, the 6800XT, you are seeing that very easily now you can do 4K north, 4K north of 60 FPS at medium settings, minus ray tracing, and we'll talk about that a little later on, minus ray tracing with rage mode on. So, is there a benefit? We would say at medium, if you're going to run at medium, which is most of these cards we're going to talk about, more than likely you're going to be medium or low at 4K, unfortunately, just because of the optimization. But if you run at 6900XT, is it worth turning SAM on, and is it worth turning rage mode on? Yes, I say in that case it probably is. But that's all we're going to talk about SAM, that's all we're going to talk about rage mode. Again, we want to give you a good, basically, rundown of it in general. You are going to see some benefit if you wanted to turn it on, if it's worth giving in there just to make it a little bit, give you a little bit more headroom. Recommend turning it on for all of these cards. It's not hard to do, but again, you're going to introduce more noise and potential heat specifically for these cards moving forward. So now let's talk about the individual cards, and let's start with the Radeon 6800. Technically, this is supposed to be better than the 3070, but when we come into the world of CyberPunk, unfortunately, we're not talking about 3070 numbers specifically for AMD. Now, I did want to give one caveat. Understand, up until this point, we've been talking about every NVIDIA, we've had basically ultra high, medium, low, and then we've had medium ray tracing and ultra ray tracing. But there is no preset ray tracing setting for AMD. When you look at the splash screen for CyberPunk 2077, it's going to show that RTX, and that technology is what allows a preset. So now, given that presets are all we're really looking at here, we are not going to delve into what does ray tracing mean for AMD cards. There is no preset for this. We expect it to be absolutely terrible. We didn't delve into that because then that changes the complexity of this altogether. So what did we test? Well, we tested just the standard presets. We tested ultra, high, medium, and low. And again, this one is technically, if you're okay with 30 FPS, you are able to actually play 4K at greater than 30 FPS on a RX6800, which is awesome. I mean, the fact that we have an AMD card that's capable of doing that is fantastic. It obviously gets better as we get to low, medium, and low. And low, not quite 60 FPS, so it makes it really hard for us to even recommend 4K at all, because again, that's where we're setting the bar in terms of minimum for playing this. So recommendation for the Radeon RX6800 is a light 1440p Ultra, probably a very strong 1440p high. And if you are going to use SAM, and if you're going to use rage mode, you want to use those at 4K medium or 4K low. Anything on 1440p, you're all well above where we've actually noticed a difference at high and ultra, and so not really worth turning on for that. Now let's talk about the Radeon 6800XT. And welcome to the first of the weird because this is the first of the weird things that actually happened when we saw specifically with AMD. And we'll talk a little bit more about the weird when we get to the 6900 XT. Here's the deal. You can play 4K low on a 6800 XT, and it's for some reason, and we don't know why, but on low, and this is for the 6800 and the 6900, it is frame locked. What we think is there is something, because once you go to 1440p Ultra, you can see that it jumps well into that 80 frames per second, but for some reason at 4K low, this thing gets locked, as does the 6900 XT, at 60 frames per second. And you can also look, when you talk about that 1% frame rate, notice how it's at 59.8 and the average frame rate is 59.9. Usually that 1% would jump north of 60, but because of that we're seeing there's an artificial, and we don't know if it's a bug or something that's happening, but specifically around 4K low, when it comes to AMD cards, we are seeing some sort of artificial gate at going at close to 60 FPS. You could do 4K medium with an RX6800 XT. You're looking at 58.6 frames per second. This is something where turning on SAM and Rage mode would technically give you very similar performance in terms of 4K medium in that north of 60 FPS. Not much, maybe 61, maybe 62 frames. You're gonna see a little bit of the dips below there, but in terms of hitting that bar, you are capable of doing that. Recommendation for this is obviously, given where AMD is and what we really think is that for AMD cards, that this is a straight up like basically DX doing its thing. There's no optimizations because of that. And really 1440p Ultra, this thing absolutely crushes at doing 80 FPS. I mean, all in all, you are going to have a fantastic Ultra experience of CyberPunk at 1440p with Ultra settings, playing the entire game, no issue. It's just the question is if you're hoping to get, when you bought a 6800 XT, which, I mean, Lord knows these are harder to get than a freaking 3080 right now, you are going to have a really great, you're going to have a medium to okay experience, well, medium and even high and Ultra, which you could play. You're looking at a greater than a Series X experience, no ray tracing, but all in all, is still looking pretty good. Now, one of the things that I will say is that with the January 21st patch that's coming out, and given that consoles, specifically the Series X and the PlayStation 5, are using AMD's implementation of GPUs, you may see better ray tracing support for these. We will not be testing that again until we test with all the PC performance stuff in March, but something to be aware of, that you might see a nice leap in AMD with those console patches, just given that the architecture there is all AMD, and so you might get a double boost as an AMD adopter for CyberPunk 2077, specifically given those additions. Now again, both AMD and Intel in this case, very much the same within margin of error. SAM and Rage mode could potentially help you in this particular case, specifically with 4K medium or 4K, well, not with 4K low because it was hitting that easily. So 4K medium, if you wanted to just get a little bit better and have a very similar experience to a 3080 without ray tracing, you could do that with this card. Now let's talk about the really weird one, and that's the 6900 XT. So welcome to the 6900 XT, and the other weird but not weird when you really think about it. And I want to take a step back because I want to explain something to just kind of set some context as to why we're probably seeing numbers like this. Understand the leap between the RTX 3080 and the RTX 3090 is quite a bit bigger than the leap between the 6800 XT and the 6900 XT. Remember, this is only a $1,000 card. And when you saw the percentage leaps when AMD did a lot of their showing this card off for the first time, remember you had to have Rage mode on and SAM on and all these other things to really kind of have this thing shine the way the 6900 XT, the way the 3090 did. When you look at the numbers, which we're showing here for the first time now, you are looking and saying, Robey, the difference between the 6800 XT and the 6900 XT are very close to the same. And yes, you are right, the DirectX libraries, as they're being used in a default form, because this is how the developers are basically doing it in this case. This is how we're guessing they're doing it. Because of that, a lot of the magic that AMD put into this isn't being flexed because the closeness between the 6800 and the 6900 is so similar. And because of that, you're seeing very similar numbers between the two. Now, at Ultra and, at Ultra, you're seeing 5 frames per second. At the 4K low, we're seeing that weird artificial 60 frame lock. But again, high and medium, you're seeing, 2, 3, 4, even 5, 6 frames higher, but still within somewhat the margin of error in terms of as you're getting in this. Again, Recommendation for this is 1440p Ultra. You have a much better chance of doing 4K medium in this one, right? Because you're probably going to hit a much more solid, specifically given Rage mode and SAM on 4K medium to hit north of 60, probably because the boost will be better, specifically on this one, so to speak. But for the most part, these are still, both the 6800 and the 6900 are going to be really great 1440p gaming experiences until we see optimizations from CD Projekt Red that will really take advantage of these two cards. And again, none of these are getting ray tracing in the way that they are getting in NVIDIA, just given how much NVIDIA has invested and CD Projekt Red has invested towards doing ray tracing on NVIDIA GPUs. So will this look as good? Not necessarily. And given 14, you saw the numbers from both the 3070 and 3060 and 3080. Ray tracing actually makes a very big difference in terms of how the game looks visually, and that's something that's just lacking on the AMD side. Now, that's not to say you're going to have a bad experience. If this is one of the cards that you got in there, you're going to have a pretty good experience. You're just going to miss probably one of the biggest selling points, and I use selling points lightly, but ray tracing does mean something in this game for when you're using an AMD card, so to speak. So, recommendation if you're doing AMD, if you're doing your recommendation for AMD and you're like, Robey, what's the AMD card I should get? Honestly, we're saying the Radeon 6800XT. Best bang for buck. You're gonna get that 4K Ultra, it's 1440p Ultra, just like you should. I'm guessing well within as the performance stuff starts to change as they're improving consoles, because the consoles get so much benefit because they're AMD architecture, you will see the biggest boosts on those cards. And then hopefully we'll also see some better ray tracing support, given they're going to want to do that for the Series X and the PlayStation 5, which both support ray tracing and are using AMD's architecture. 6900, I mean, even if it's like a $200-300 difference, I just don't see a benefit in terms of going to this if you're CyberPunk specific. The reason I recommend the 6900 is because the 6800XT and the 6900XT are so closely related that it would take a lot of work for CD Projekt Red to ink all of the power that you would need to get out of a card like this. That's not to say I don't love this card. I do, and I'm really excited about having one and super glad that AMD hooked us up with one. But in this case, it's just not really worth it, the extra money, for this particular game. And we'll be doing more testing with this in the future. So that's it. That's every card, but we should wrap it up and give you just a general consensus like, hey, here's the wrap up, and show it up in this nice little graphic right here. And then you're gonna show a cool graphic, it's gonna have music, I'm gonna be dancing, yeah, cool, look at my shirt. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, was a lot of information. And I really hope that it was useful. Because what I wanted you to get out of this is really kind of understand what the difference between AMD and NVIDIA was, whether SAM and whether Rage mode made a difference, what ray tracing really meant if you're using an NVIDIA GPU, and then finally, what you should do based on the card that you're either going to purchase or have purchased in terms of getting your best experience at 60 frames per second in CyberPunk 2077. And we definitely gave you all the information you really need if you wanted to say, hey, if I'm gonna play at 4K or any one of those things as well, we gave you that information as well. Love to know down in the comments below what your thoughts are. And if we were to do this again for, say, a different game, what were things that you would like us to add? Now, one thing I will say, I'm not gonna add 1080p because again, 1080p is so CPU dependent that changes the dynamics so heavily. And given I really feel like gaming is starting to trend towards it. But I'd love to know if you saw a 1080p video, what would you like to see in terms of that stuff? We tried very hard as well to make sure that this information was super clear, and I tried very hard to make sure that it was understandable. I mean, I love Steve. Steve's amazing. But Lord knows so many of us watch it and have no freaking clue what the heck that guy is talking about. And that is not what we want from our videos. So let me know, was there anything down below that was confusing? And then finally, did you enjoy it? Is there something that we could have done to make it better? Because we try to make these entertaining and they take so much work. And I want to give a huge shout out to people like Brian and Kevin, specifically the newest member of our team, who really made who are gonna make these kind of videos so possible in the future. So give a shout out to him down in the comments below, make him feel welcome, because it would suck if he quit, and then we'd be very, very sad. Anyway, guys, while you're down there, make sure you slap that subscribe button, whip that like button, and ring that notification bell so we get a note, While you're down there, make sure you slap that subscribe button. While you're down there, make sure that you spank. No. While you're down there, make sure that you, slap that subscribe button, whip that like button, and ring that notification bell so you get a notification each and every time these videos go live. We're going to be a lot more consistent coming into 2021. If you want to see more content like this and be notified and be the first one, then that's definitely something you're going to do. Also, we now have a live show, and it happens at different times now. And that live show is every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, over here, right here on YouTube, or you can just check us out over on Twitch. We also have an amazing Discord community where you can talk about all these things, talk with me, and we can have discussions about all the things that you love and all the things that you hate. No, that's actually not true. Just all the things that you love right over there, and all the stuff for that is all down in the description below. Guys, we super appreciate your time. We hope this helps you playing CyberPunk 2077, and we will see you in Night City in the future.